I don't know if I get up today. I don't know if I'll give one single today. My whole outlook is sunken gray, and I have no idea why I woke up this way. Got my phone in my right hand, my books on the nightstand. If I unlock and I app pop, I'm stuck there, I'm a dead man. So Lord, give me the strength to please read one page. If it works in any way, I'll move on to the next thing. Oh dear, I got my socks on, I'm coming up.
Welcome to Positively Undefeated. This is a podcast that talks about the day-to-day struggle ordinary people have over their demons and how each day they remain positively undefeated. We share ideas and ways that you can empower yourself to remain strong so that you can embrace the journey.
How you feeling?
I feel a lot better today.
Good.
Lots better.
So for you guys that don't know, Rhonda has COVID for like the 100th time. How many times have you had COVID?
3, actually.
Oh my God. I have to be careful because if I say too much about COVID, I might get my podcast taken off. But
Right.
But you know, it's crazy because we talked about yesterday. You're probably one of the most vaccinated people I know,
I've had every vaccine I can possibly have,
and yet
like 6 or something. Yeah.
No. Well, I sure appreciate you taking the time to be on the podcast. I've been friends for a number of years. How many years have we been friends?
It's been a while. What, like 6, 5?
Yeah. We used to work together. I'm curious I want to say thank you for being on the board too. I appreciate that very much. I think you're a great asset to the board, and, I appreciate you being on the board and being willing to serve and participate and all that.
Well, it's important to me. So.
Well, and, if people can go back and listen to your original podcast, which was, I think, like over 2 years ago. Does that sound right?
I think so.
And, I think that we talked a little bit about your story back then about how your son's dad committed suicide. And
yes.
You guys were divorced right at that time, but still
we were.
Major impact. And
yes.
And so if people want to hear that story, I definitely, encourage you to go back and listen to Rhonda's first podcast. Today, I really wanted to ask you, I tell this story a lot, and we might have talked about it in the first podcast because I don't remember, but, you did something for me that really had a major impact on me, because during a time period whenever I was really going through a hard time and trying to, figure it out, you said that, according to an assessment that you were doing through a hospice agency you were working for, that really I had like some major trauma or major stresses during, this period of time in my life. And you really just pointed it out that, hey, you're going through a lot, and, you gave the proof by, hey, you've had a death, and you've gone through a divorce, and these things. And I remember it's not so much that it wasn't that it was shocking, but it was more of like, wow, I didn't think about it like that. I think we have a tendency to like downplay things in our life, because like if you talk about trauma, that's a word that seems to be like overused maybe. And, what I was doing was kind of making excuses for things to say like, well, but other people are going through a harder time. Or, I might say something like, it's been a couple of years since my cousin died, or, whatever. I was not thinking in like this 5-year time period that so much had happened. And it was a big eye opener for me. And so I am very appreciative of that. Can you describe like what that assessment is like? I know it doesn't completely pertain to, it's definitely for hospice, correct?
Right. Well, and so what you were saying about sometimes we tend to just kind of gloss over what we have going on. I think maybe is that part of the generation that we were raised in. I mean, maybe our parents just, whatever's wrong, you don't want to have a pity party, or you don't want to seem like you're saying, woe is me, and I think that's just part of maybe how we were raised, just to not focus on ourselves or something. I don't know, but I think we all tend to do that. But yeah, the assessment I was talking about was for hospice, and it was actually for the families, like the caregivers or whatever, whoever their significant person was in their life. And so it was to assess the family members or significant persons risk for basically how well they were going to be able to cope with this current problem they had, or the current situation of having someone that's in an end of life situation. And so the look back was like 5 years. And so if they had had any significant loss within the last 5 years, and that could be a death, it could be any big event, a loss of a job, a divorce, of course, a death, any significant thing that could be considered a loss, it increased their risk for how they were going to deal with this, and whether it was going to be a negative outcome. And so when you stack up multiple things, if you had multiple deaths, or a death and a divorce, or any of those major things stacked up on each other within a 5-year period, increases your risk for how well you're going to deal with this current issue that you have, whatever it might be. And so, I mean, obviously it was for those families that were dealing with having someone who had just been admitted to hospice care. But I mean, really that applies to any of us.
Yeah. I mean, I think it was very impactful, and even now I think about it a lot when we're talking about developing workshops and things, through Even One Less, then, that comes to mind because, number one, like you said, it's a good reminder, because I think it falls in under awareness, or it falls under like, really, well, I guess awareness is the best way to say it, is, we're just being aware of where you're at. And I think that, it also speaks to this fact where it almost falls under, like, we don't want to ask for help,
Right.
because, like what you were saying, we're downplaying, what's going on in our life. And it's not like we're saying, oh, I want you to just camp there, and I want you to just, think about it constantly. It's more of being aware. When I was aware of, like, okay, maybe I'm just not loony for feeling the way I feel, because that's really what it comes down to. It's like, okay, I felt like I had permission to be where I was at and grieve. And it like opened up that permission. Because I think I was making excuses for a lot of things that were going on in my life, and not realizing the impact, or just thinking I needed to get over it. And so that awareness was very helpful. And then the ability to, once you're aware of it, to be able to kind of talk about it and just kind of sit in that place of like, okay, this is, there's been a lot going on. And it's very true. When I look back now and I see everything that was going on at that time period, I think that it felt like I had permission to kind of, grieve and heal, and I didn't feel so guilty about, being in that place. I didn't feel like I was crazy, so that it made a huge impact.
Well, and I think you said something that made me think of something else, but a few years back, probably, I don't know, 7 or 8 years ago, something happened in my life, and it was traumatic for sure. And when it happened, instead of maybe like you talked about, just dealing with it and grieving or feeling all the things that you need to work through it, I just brushed it off and just went right along, rocked along in life, and acted like really nothing had happened. And then like a year later, my world caved in, and I was mad and And I ended up going to a counselor about it, and they were like, oh yeah, this is what you call delayed grief, delayed onset grief.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, what's that mean? And they said, well, it's almost like your body, your brain in an attempt to preserve yourself, because I get that's what our brains are wired to do, whether we realize it or not. And sometimes it does that without us giving it permission or whatever.
Yeah.
And so that's what you do. And so, but if you don't allow yourself to feel all the feels, good, bad, negative, whatever it is, and you work through those, it's going to come out later. And it's usually not pretty when that does that. So it is better to, even though it hurts and it's painful, let yourself sit in it and feel it. And that's how we get better from whatever the situation is.
Yeah. I think there's so much truth to that. I go back to, like, I don't know, again, maybe it's the way we were raised, like you were talking about, where we don't want to acknowledge those things because it makes us look weak, or, we feel like we're living in the past, or I just don't know. But I think it's a great point for healing and being able to turn the page, because if you don't even acknowledge that you've got some issues, or acknowledge that you have some real, trauma or whatever, then you're not going to be able to go to work toward healing. And so it's a big eye opener. How do you think, how many pages or whatever, how long is this assessment? Do you even know the name of it?
I don't. It was part of the, like the charting software, the medical record software for hospice.
Yeah.
So I don't remember the name of it. It was basically called the risk assessment, for the families.
Yeah. I definitely want to use a form of that in our workshop. And I think, I took an assessment whenever I was in treatment. I took an assessment, and that assessment was like a trauma assessment. And I think that was very useful too. Same thing. It's like, I think we've overused that word trauma. Maybe we hear it a lot on like TikTok and social media. And so you automatically kind of roll your eyes, or I do. It's like, oh gosh, trauma. We all have, PTSD. And somehow, you didn't even hear those words really. If you think about like 15, 20 years ago, I don't even know that we heard those words. Mm-hmm. So now it's very easy. We hear those words, we kind of roll our eyes and we downplay it like we're talking about. But I think we need to look at it fresh and different, and thinking that the only, like I was saying, the only way to really heal or to be able to make changes is for you to be honest about where you're at right now. And that,
well, when you mentioned PTSD, I think for the longest time, our reference for that was veterans or someone who had been in a, like a combat situation. And really, when talking about when I was going to counseling and they were talking about the delayed onset grief and all that, and she mentioned PTSD, and she said anything that was traumatic that happened in your life, you can have a PTSD response later on. And I think we've talked about that too. It could be something you haven't thought about in a while, or you feel like, oh, I'm healed from that and I'm okay. And then maybe you see something, or you hear a song, or you smell a smell, or anything. And it's almost like you feel that feeling physically in your gut. And that's what that is. Like, that's a trauma response that you really don't have any control over. That's your body's, that's a physiological response.
Yeah.
And so, trauma and a response to that is real.
Well, and whenever you're talking about that, it reminds me, it's like, we all know that we shouldn't judge other people. That's like biblical. It's something we instinctively know is not a good thing to judge other people. But also, if you're using that reference, the Bible talks about not even judging ourselves, that we're not capable. And I think this falls under that we have a tendency to judge it negatively, saying you should be over it. You should, why are you, and comparing. We compare ourselves to other people and say, well, I haven't gone through this like they have. And we really don't know what they've gone through. We don't understand it. And the only person we can affect is ourselves. And so when we're honest about, ourselves and what's going on and not comparing it to other people, because I think that when we compare, we automatically like push our own feelings or whatever down, because we feel like if we compare, we always lose out. We're always saying, oh, it's not as bad. You can always find somebody in this world who's gone through more trauma, more problems. And I think when you compare it like that, you ultimately do yourself a big disservice, because you're not being honest with yourself and what's going on with yourself. And you're judging yourself and saying, okay, you need to be over this. You need to have moved on. And yet you're saying those words, but it hasn't happened. It's
Right.
not, you haven't moved on. You just think you have, or you think you should have. And, I think it's pretty powerful, truly.
Well, and you've heard people say that, talking about just decision making, just in and of itself, that every decision you make takes some mental and emotional energy. And so if you're making big decisions or lots of decisions, like it wears down on that energy. And so really that same thing applies to the energy and the stamina that you have to work through any kind of trauma situation or anything. Even if you have just a stressful day, if you've had these other situations happen, that has taken up some of that mental and emotional energy. And so then, I think that's why, if it's been within the last 5 years, that it stacks up your risk, because that tells you how long it takes for us to recover from some of that stuff. And so we don't have the same stamina and the ability to recover as if someone who hasn't had anything happen yet in their life,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's so true. Again, that conversation, which happened, at least 2-3 years ago. I don't remember at least a couple of years ago, but another reason that I think it stayed with me is, I started, I think, being a little bit more aware of things that affected me, had a negative effect. Like I might feel more depressed today or whatever. And it made me start to recognize those things a little bit better. And part of it's giving myself a break and saying, okay, not being so hard, maybe because I'm upset today or aggravated or mad or whatever. And I just became more aware. I'll point out an example that I found pretty interesting, that, living out in the country, which I have most of my life, you see a lot of animals die, whether hit by a car, your dog, or, I can name several incidences. Like, I know it's so crazy this happened, but I'll never forget, we had like this brand new little kitten, and I come out of the house and I accidentally step on this cat, and my kids are all watching. And of course the thing suffers and dies. It's a sad situation. And even though that, like, it's a part of life, that's what I feel like, especially when you live out in the country, you deal with animals and whatever. If you have animals, you're going to deal with those things. But I was actually surprised by how much that, when I thought about it, really had affected me, and part of it is like, there was also a little guilt in there because, I stepped on this cat, or I let this dog get hit by a car, whatever. And even though that sounds so small, I realized the impact that it had on, and when you add those other factors, like back to the 5 years, when you add the factors of like, okay, I've dealt with this death and dealt with divorce or whatever, then like you were saying, it's like your ability to cope with things are greatly decreased. So if you have like a dog die during this time period, and with that history, then it impacts your life way more, and then you have a hard time dealing with it, but it may come out in other ways where you don't even recognize it. Maybe it comes out in anger, or you're really short with people or, kind of like depressed. And that conversation again made me more aware that, wow, those things can really have an effect on you.
For sure. For sure. And I think, which this is just more along the lines of asking for help. We've talked about that, but, I have some family members that are dealing with anxiety and some things right now. And I've never been a big proponent of, well, just go get on some medicine. But truly, I have to remind myself, our brains are an organ just like any other part of our body. And sometimes different people's, the wiring in your brain, like your transmitters, your brain chemistry, like some of that is not optimal always for whatever reason. And so sometimes you do need medication or something to straighten that stuff out. And that's okay. It's okay to say that, I feel like the stigma, that gone along with the mental health and, I just don't like it. I wish it would go away. And so I feel like talking about it, like that's what part of this is for, is talking about things and getting people comfortable with saying it out loud.
Mm-hmm. I know it seems like when you are going through whatever, you fill in the blank, when you're going through something, I think that it's almost we do a shotgun effect and we go out there and we look for answers. Like me, I noticed that I had a tendency to read a lot of self-help books or read a lot of spiritual books to try to reach for that help. And, and we may also do that. I think we do that, like maybe we reach out to somebody at church or we go to church more hoping to get some answers. And, it feels like, for me, like I might have searched out those answers and then felt disappointed whenever I didn't get those answers. And then you almost it's easy to become discouraged with God because it's like I'm a Christian and I'm out there searching for these answers and I go to what I believe is the best way to do it. We're smart people. So we go to what we think might work. And then when it doesn't work, or in our mind, it doesn't work, and then we become extremely discouraged with God, extremely discouraged with, whatever we find that, that it almost feels superficial, that it just, I've been saying lately that it seems like a lot of things are heavy on problem. They tell you all about the problem and it's easy to be like, amen. Yes, yes. I agree with the problem, but like light on solution, there doesn't seem to be a lot of substance when it comes to solutions.
Well, and even like when you were saying that, it made me think, the times that I've gone to counseling, because I've gone probably 3 different times in my life. And I was thinking back to this counselor, she's got more education than me, she's got licenses that I don't have. But really, I didn't go in and she didn't say, okay, do step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then you're fixed. The majority of what we did was she would ask me questions and I would talk about it. Like that was really, she gave me a few practical things, but for the most part, it was mostly just talking about it and saying it. And it's like she said, when you say some things out loud, they lose their power a little bit. The more you say them, and there really is truth in that.
I agree with that. It's funny because if you actually talk to a decent counselor, they won't give you advice. They won't tell you how to fix it. They won't. They really won't.
Right. And that's what I was looking for. Yeah. That's what I was looking for, but that's not what happened,
But a good counselor won't. A good counselor, kind of lets you figure it out yourself. And I think we do know the answers. It's just, we're so clouded, I think, by the things we're talking about, clouded by tragedy, clouded by, these traumas or these things that have happened in our life. We're just so clouded by it. And
for sure.
It's funny because, I've told you that here lately, I've just felt like a little bit discontent, I don't know, irritable, discontent. And I think it has a lot to do with surrounded by the holidays. And as we've talked about, my mom passed away on Christmas. It was really the next day, but it was at that night. It was technically on the 26th, and that was, a couple of years ago.
Mm-hmm.
But there's multiple factors that I just feel like, okay, this is why I'm feeling this way. But I realized yesterday or this morning, it really hit me that I'm living this really great life. And the great life is that, I can take time in the middle of the day to do a podcast, which I really enjoy. Mm-hmm. Or I can take time, I'm doing a lot of things that I really enjoy, but they don't seem to produce the results that sometimes we think they should, and it's a good reminder. It's almost like being thankful for what you have, but it's even more than that. I think that these tragedies or these traumas, they can make you believe that life sucks.
Right.
You know what I mean?
And the holidays and Christmas, especially, like it just brings up lots of emotions, whether it's happy and, all the joy of whatever, but then it also, it's emotional in the ways that it reminds you of, people that aren't here anymore, or, there's just lots of emotions, good and bad, that go with it. And so, this time of year, if you're struggling at all, is going to magnify that for sure. I've learned that from my own, situations, and different years have been harder than others for sure.
Most people don't realize this. I didn't realize this, that like Thanksgiving, I'm sure Christmas is right behind it, but Thanksgiving is the number one day for relapse for people who are addicted to alcohol or drugs.
I can believe that.
But Thanksgiving is the number one day that they relapse.
I believe that. And then that's just like the first day leading into this season of, emotional days. It's
pretty wild. I was told that, and I was like, it got me really thinking about that too. I was like, wow. I think it's it's pressure we put on ourselves, or pressure, but family dynamics can be very stressful, depending on the situation. Mm-hmm. I've been talking, Rhonda, lately about, or I've been really thinking about this idea of like a toolbox, that you really need multiple ways to heal and recover. Excuse me. And part of that, like what I mean by that is like, yes, counseling, might be part of your toolbox, and it might be working out as part of your toolbox, and it might be your church family as part of your, multiple. And I'm curious what, and like in your life, what is in your toolbox? Like, what do you, use to kind of deal with life?
Well, for sure, working out, going to the gym. And I think we've talked about before that, which it always makes me laugh, but flossing your teeth. Like if it's the day that you floss your teeth, like you're doing the ultimate self-care and all the things that make you feel better, but there really is truth in it. The gym, I'm not always successful, but I try to get up in time before I go to the gym to read my Bible and pray, just to get my brain on the right track for the day. That definitely helps. I go to church, on Sundays. And so hopefully that gets my, thought process right for the week. There's a group of people there. I don't have a large group of friends at church, but there's a small group of people I'm friends with outside of church. And so I think trying to stay connected to them during the week, helps a lot. Mm-hmm. It's hard this time of year. I try to eat fairly clean, and I feel like that helps too. This is silly too, but even this week being homesick, like I still tried to get up and, take a shower and put some clothes on of some sort. And it just makes you feel better. Like even the days that you don't want to, you don't feel like it, sometimes just going through the motions and doing some of that stuff that is good for you, it'll make you feel better. Even if you don't want to get up and go to the gym, they say those are the most important days to go. And so I found that to be true. Get up and go, and it gets your mind right. The endorphins, it creates that not happy, but you know what I'm saying? And the endorphins create that, get your thought process on a more positive path than if you didn't have that.
Yeah. I think that's so true. And I think it's important to point that out because I don't think one thing is the answer. There's no magic pill. There's no, you do this. A lot of people, I believed this at one time. I wouldn't have said it, but I believed it, which is if I'm doing counseling, then, that should be good enough. It's just not good enough. And
Right.
counseling definitely has a place. And I think it's a great, part of healing and, and just getting better. But I think one item or two is not going to do it. It's going to have to be multiple things that you do. And I love the way you said it because that's really kind of what this, our organization and ministry is based on. It's based on the fact that we're really focusing outside of acute and like crisis. We're focusing on, the spiritual and mental. We're focusing on the physical. We're focusing on the material. Because I strongly believe if you are, let's say you want to, again, start your own business or you really, have a goal in life that you want to do, like maybe you're going to school or maybe you're taking a class or maybe you've got a work project. I think that when you're working on those things, it gets out of your own head and you're actually able to focus outside of yourself. And I think the likelihood of you really dealing with like a depressive episode or suicidal tendencies is greatly reduced in any of those areas. I keep saying, hey, if a person works out every day, I think it greatly reduces the chance that they're going to have suicidal thoughts just by that one action. And again, I don't think just working out's the answer. I think it's that toolbox that we're talking about where you're actually, doing multiple things. But also, I think you pointed out, it's like those multiple things don't have to be grandiose.
No.
And literally, okay, I went to church and I saw a couple of people there that I really like, and that made me feel better. I think that we don't give enough credit to those things.
Right. And you don't have to have this, list of 20 people that are your friends. I mean, I've got lots of acquaintance / friends that I call friends, but they're not what I would say in my close circle of who I talk to. My close circle of who, I share things with is pretty small. There may be 3 or 4, and you being one of them, and we've talked about that, the importance of having somebody that you can share yourself with that is not going to judge you, if it sounds ridiculous, or that on the other side is also, if it is ridiculous, or if you're going down a road that you don't need to, that's going to say, hey, pay attention to what you're doing. Don't do that, and so it's important to have, even if it's just one person that will do that for you, stay connected to them,
I don't know if I've told you this, but I've had this kind of like revelation lately, which is, and I didn't come up with it. I just really put it together through different people and different things. But I think that you have to be like, there's 3 people that you have to be honest with in any kind of healing. One, you have to be honest with yourself. It's like, and that's what we're talking about, like with this assessment. And it's just being honest with where you're at, and I think there's nothing wrong with you being honest and saying, man, I feel irritable. I feel discontent. And then thinking about why do I feel that way? And it could have been, because your mom died on Christmas and it's holiday. I mean, it could be any of those. And it could even be a lesser thing, like the animal thing that I was talking about that you would not think that affects. And so being honest with yourself. And then I think secondly is being honest with God. And I think in the same way, we make excuses like God knows everything. He already knows. But I think it's really verbalizing that to God, that this is what's going on, because I don't think it helps God understand more. I think it helps us understand God more,
For sure.
And then I think the third part of that is that we're honest with one other person about what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that it can be, anybody. It could be a spouse. It could be a friend. It could be, sometimes it could be almost a stranger in that situation, where you like literally tell somebody something that's going on. I think we've all done that where we tell like almost a stranger something that's going on in our life. And it just felt like right at the time to say it.
Mm-hmm.
But I think those three components are really a formula almost for like healing and getting better.
For
And
sure.
I think they have to be repeated almost daily, depending on what's going on.
Well, and one thing, and it's funny because you had said that to me and said, be honest with yourself, God, and one other person. And so something that I was struggling with, I prayed about it and I was like, okay, God, help me to not go down that road. And even though he already knew, we talked about that, but he really has done that. And it's almost, I don't know, comical is not the right word, but I mean, he really and truly has done exactly what I prayed about. So,
yeah. Well, I think about it, it's like I feel like we understand when we say, okay, you got to be honest with yourself about what's going on, which may be, realization that in the last 5 years, you've had these many things going on.
mm-hmm.
You're realizing that you're feeling discontent or depressed I think that's where we understand that. But we've made excuses for it, as in, like we were talking about, we downplay it. We do all these things. Well, it's a path to healing, to be honest with yourself. But then you go to the God thing. I think it keeps us, I don't think I strongly believe that God doesn't cut us off or God doesn't, leave us or turn away from us. But I do believe we end up cutting ourselves off from God because we feel guilty, because we feel he already knows, and just think about it. It's like, if I'm going to call, a close friend and I automatically in my head, well, he already knows everything that's going on. So I don't tell him what's going on. Then really what I've done is cut myself off from that relationship because it's back to the superficial. It's all superficial. I'm just telling you, it's like teenagers are the king of how was your day? Good, fine, okay. Good, fine, okay. And I almost feel like we do that to each other. Like, yeah, it's good, fine, and okay when your world's falling apart.
Right. That's just our automatic answer.
To God too. Like, you already know, so everything's good, fine, and okay. And yet, even though he does already know, it's almost freeing to say, for us to say it to him. Like, even though he already knows whatever. I mean, it helps to remind us that he really does love us that much. Like it doesn't matter whatever it is. He loves us anyway. Just like we love our kids. Doesn't matter what they've done. We still love them. Yeah. It's funny because I read this in a book and I can't remember what book, but it was, and it was very impactful. It was years ago. It was saying that the two areas we don't pray about or we don't bring God into in our marriage is one is sex. We don't bring God into that because it's like, it's almost we're like, we're going to talk to God about sex.
Yeah.
And then, also finances, and what it was saying is that those two subjects almost feel taboo when it comes to talking to God about it, or we think we got it handled or whatever.
Right.
And yet those are the two reasons for divorce, two major reasons for divorce. And it was, pretty impactful to think about that. It's like in those circumstances, you can say, oh, God already knows about that, both of those things. But, really it's a missed opportunity for us to really express to God, what's in our minds and in our hearts, even though, yes, he already knows it. But I think I actually, and I'll say this, I think that God actually gets excited about hearing about anything,
I think, he wants a relationship with us. Like that's why he created us. Like he wants that relationship with us. And so when we reciprocate what he's been trying to do for us, of course he does. But we
I think
forget
also,
that.
if you think about it, like a friendship, the difference between an acquaintance and a friend, like a true friend, is really that.
For
Because
sure.
like an acquaintance, you're normally just going to be like, everything's good, fine, and okay. But a true friend, you're going to tell them what's going on. You
Right.
know, be like, this is, and I think that we understand that because we have so many acquaintances with work and with our social life of church or wherever. But then, you know, if you take that same thought and you flip it to God and saying, okay, same thing. Do you want him to be an acquaintance or do you want him to or do you want to have a real relationship?
Yeah.
Because same thing, a true friend may know that you've got stuff going on in your life, but if you're not willing to talk about it or bring it, and it kind of goes back to that counseling. Ironically, it's like this full circle, because if you go to the counselor, you're really all he or she's trying to do is get you to like talk about and kind of solve your own problems. But it's really talking through it. You know, that's why they teach you communication, to kind of mirror or you know, mirror what people are saying,
and that's exactly what they do in counseling. You'll say something and they mirror it back.
Yeah, it's mirroring. And part of it's like, if I say you're a dumbass and then you repeat that, I'm a dumbass. Well, then I go, well, I didn't mean you're a dumbass.
Right.
But, you know, but part of it, I think that it's like hearing our own words sometimes, like really. And I think that that's, you know, not to get, some people get weirded out by this, but I think that's what the Holy Spirit does, is that it's like we say, I'm a dumbass. And then the Holy Spirit comes through and says, no, you're not. You're a child of God. You're, you know, loved, and you're, you know,
for sure.
You see what I'm saying? I think that's part of like his job. And I think the only way well, I'll put it this way. I think these words, 2 words have been impactful too lately, which is we got to be willing to tell God, willing to tell a friend, willing to be honest. And then it's also that there's a little bit of seeking in there. I think we're probably pretty good at seeking answers, but I think that you got to add that element of being willing to like just kind of bathe in it and
sit in it. Sometimes you don't. Sometimes you don't even have to talk to them. Just sit with them.
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, it's funny because I think that you have a lot of insight on those things about trauma and you know, I even remember recently I was telling you about, you know, we're working on a land deal, and the way I was feeling, you know, we're trying to purchase this land, and the way I was feeling, you were like, that comes from kind of a trauma response, because, and it was a big eye opener. I think in the past, again, I would have rolled my eyes and been like, oh yeah, come on.
Right.
But to hear you say it, it's like, okay, maybe this is why I'm feeling anxious about this. And maybe this is why. It just helps me understand a little bit more about what's going on. You know, instead of I'm just crazy. You know, a lot of times we just feel crazy. Like, I can't think of a better word, because it's like, I feel like I'm nuts sometimes. And yet that starts to make sense. Maybe I'm nuts because, you know, last time I went down this road, it was not good.
Well, and I think, and I've thought about this too, like being, you know, 22 or 25. And at that point in time, I was pretty sheltered. I hadn't had anything bad happen, like just whatever. And so, and I look back and think, okay, 22 or 23-year-old Rhonda, I didn't really have nothing bad had happened at that point in my life. Now, probably 25, 27, 28, that's when different things started happening. And it changed, you know, those things change you. You know, we talked about that. And not necessarily jade you, or it can tend to make you cynical. And maybe not even that, but just it changes because you have a knowledge of, well, this has happened before. And so these are all the things that could happen. I think the more we've been through, it just changes the way we look at life. And it's just because we've had those experiences.
Yeah. I agree with you. It's funny because like, I think that just the realization, like we're talking about, it's like, man, realizing it's like half the battle, just realizing that something's going on. And I think that you've been really good at that. I think you're a great listener too. And I think that I could learn, I think people could learn from that. Like, I'll be honest with you. It's like, I remember a time period kind of feeling guilty because it felt like every time we talked, I was just, telling, basically boohooing on your shoulder. And then I remember feeling guilty about that because it's like, oh God, I mean, she probably doesn't want to hear it again. She's sick of hearing it. But yet you never put up that vibe of like, hey, I hear what's going on, even though you probably had stuff going on too. It's not like I was the only one, but I think that's like a skill. That's like superpower. That's a superpower.
We all just take our turns.
Yeah.
I'll have to I boo-hoo to you sometimes too. So
yeah, it's pretty interesting. I think that anyway. Well, Rhonda, I hope you feel better. I know that you,
I do. I think I'm on the mend.
I think that you could write a book over two things. One, trauma and response and how you deal with that. And two,
COVID.
You could be like the COVID expert.
Right.
But like I said, I've got to be careful because I talk about COVID too much. They're going to kick me off this place.
Right. I thought I could go back to work Monday, but I was wrong. I have to test negative Monday, and then I have to test negative Tuesday also. So I can't. Tuesday I can go back to work.
Well, I mean, you're definitely a trooper because I know you don't feel 100% and you're getting on a podcast. And so thank you so much. And I hope you have a good day and all that good stuff.
You too. Thank you.
Talk to you soon.
All right. Bye.
Thank you for listening to Positively Undefeated. If there was something in this show that resonated with you, please share the show with your community. If you want this show delivered each Monday morning to your podcast app of choice, please subscribe or follow. And if you'd like to get a hold of Burl, please do so by going to burlstricker.com/contact.